let's get Brexit done on October the 31st. Let's get it done because of the opportunities that it will bring.
Oh no, they're not frightened. They're absolutely terrified.
None of these things the EU is capable of dealing with. It has outgrown its time.
Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage and Gisela Stuart. What do these people have in common? Besides the fact that they're key figures in the UK's political landscape, all three of the people we just mentioned were strong proponents of the Brexit campaign. That's right, in 2016, these three played instrumental roles in swaying the British public to vote Leave. But there's one more we haven't mentioned here, an ironic champion of the Brexit campaign, and possibly the most influential figure on the list. Join us today as we break down the roles played by Brexiteers in pushing the UK to vote Leave when asked if the country should stay a member of the European Union. To put this into more simplistic terms, we're dissecting who's to blame for the Brexit mess. No discussion on Brexit would be complete without mentioning the former Prime Minister. Boris Johnson assumed the premiership in 2019 under less than ideal circumstances. Theresa May had just resigned after failing to reach a consensus in Parliament over Brexit divorce terms, showcasing that withdrawal from the European Union wasn't as straightforward as they'd thought. After her resignation, the public looked towards someone who wouldn't just get the job done, but would get it done right. Someone who knew just how crucial it was to ensure that the UK exited the EU in no indefinite terms, all the while reaping at least some of the benefits of being a member, without actually being one. As we said, a less than ideal situation to assume premiership in. However, Boris Johnson, the former leader of the Conservative Party and once the Mayor of London, was more than willing to take up that role. He had, after all, been one of the most vocal supporters of the Brexit campaign. Arguably, he was quoted by members of the Leave campaign more often than just a few times on why they were voting Leave in the 2016 referendum. Make no mistake, Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister who'd get the job done. But before he made strides with Vote Leave and eventually working out Brexit divorce terms with the EU, did you know that there'd been a time when Johnson swore he'd never return to the House of Commons again? That's right. The media personality had claimed that he wouldn't seek a return to Parliament while Mayor, but eventually contested for a seat in the Conservative Party during the 2015 election. Even back then, there'd been murmurs that Johnson's return to the House of Commons was purely because he wanted a front row seat for Brexit. Several campaigns emerged in the aftermath of David Cameron's announcement that a referendum would be held, one of which was founded by Matthew Elliott and Dominic Cummings. Vote Leave became one of the strongest, if not the strongest, campaigns that were determined to sway public opinion to, well, vote Leave on the day of referendum. Backed by several political figures, Johnson became the de facto face of the campaign when he pledged his support.
I think we should take the chance now, as a country, to take back control.
This isn't to suggest that Vote Leave was squeaky clean. The campaign faced heavy criticism for its strategies and electoral law violations, with many critics claiming that the organisation did little more than strong-arm the British public. Nevertheless, it was the campaign that gathered the most support, and it was all thanks to Johnson. In more ways than some, the campaign relied on Johnson to maintain its stronghold. Johnson might have many critics, but his ability to connect with the public and his commanding media presence remains unmatched. Johnson has been credited with making persuasive arguments, enough to make him a central force in convincing voters that voting to leave would be the right thing to do. But not everything that Johnson claimed was true, or even politically correct. One of the most famous statements was the £350 million a week for the NHS one. For those of you who might not be familiar, Johnson had claimed that leaving the EU would redirect funds to the UK. To substantiate the argument, Johnson claimed that the NHS would have funds equivalent to £350 million every week, all if the nation voted to leave the EU. This statement was plastered over the side of buses in the capital and became one of Vote Leave's main slogans. However, the statement was a gross exaggeration. Yes, the UK would no longer be contributing to the EU budget, which, in theory, would redirect funds to the country itself. But no, the amount the UK provided toward the EU budget wasn't nearly enough to equate to £350 million a week. Johnson faced significant backlash for his comment, with many experts claiming that it was unethical of the future Prime Minister to be making such grossly inaccurate statements. Even Nigel Farage, another champion of the Brexit campaign and someone we'll discuss in a minute, distanced himself from Johnson after he made the statement. In a televised interview, Farage claimed that he didn't know where Johnson got his figures from and wasn't about to back the claim. But this might just have been one of the very few things that Johnson and Farage didn't see eye to eye on.
So that was Keir Starmer asking a very simple question about GPs. And here is vintage Boris's answer.
When it came to attacking the former president of the United States, Barack Obama, both Johnson and Farage came guns blazing. It's worth mentioning here that many political leaders across the world had called on the UK to reconsider its decision to withdraw from the EU, one of which was the former president of the US. However, Johnson claimed that Obama's statements were motivated by an ancestral bias. He claimed that the US president was inclined to make such statements about the sovereignty of the UK because of his half-Kenyan ancestry, something that Farage seemed to support. More problematic statements on which both political influencers seemed to agree included the rhetoric that staying in the EU for even a day longer would guarantee that 80 million Turks would make their way into the UK. Though the referendum was eventually won by the Leave side, Brexit was far from a reality until Johnson took office as Prime Minister in 2019. Under his leadership, Brexit was finally delivered after years of political deadlock. His slogan, "Get Brexit Done," became the defining message of his premiership, and he successfully negotiated a revised withdrawal agreement with the EU. On January 31st, 2020, Brexit was officially enacted, cementing Johnson's legacy as the leader who turned the referendum result into reality. Johnson stayed on as the Prime Minister for a few more years, assuring the public that everything was going according to plan, that the socio-economic downturn, according to experts, was just a lot of noise made by the Remain group who couldn't fathom the Leave group's victory. That being said, let's cover some of the statements made by Johnson in 2021, all of which were later fact-checked by the BBC. Starting with one that was a spin-off of a statement he'd already made, the UK's newfound millions. Johnson claimed that the country had already reverted money as a result of the withdrawal, although the Conservative Party didn't release an official estimate. Not that they could, according to experts, because in 2021, the UK was still paying money into the EU as part of its divorce negotiations. According to the Office for Budget Responsibility, the UK would have likely been contributing over $7.1 billion in 2021 to the EU, less than its 2020 contribution of $8.2 billion, but that still disproved what Johnson had claimed. 2020 marked the transitional period between the UK and the EU, and in 2021, Johnson's $350 million a week plan to the NHS should have been enacted. However, based on these figures, the UK would have had to give the EU $3 million each day. Johnson may have been the face of Brexit, but he severely underestimated the complexity and long-term consequences of the UK's departure from the EU. While he championed the idea of taking back control, the realities of post-Brexit Britain proved far more difficult than his campaign rhetoric suggested. The trade disruptions, labour shortages and bureaucratic hurdles that followed exposed how unprepared the UK was for life outside the EU. Many of the promises made during the referendum, such as a booming economy and frictionless trade, failed to materialise, leading to widespread criticism. To put this into perspective, take a look at the 2024 poll by YouGov that determined over 51% of the public disliked Johnson. Again, this was once the man they believed was right for the job. It would be wrong to suggest that every member of the Conservative Party was a proponent of the Brexit campaign. David Cameron, the then Prime Minister and the political figure who called for the referendum, was against it. He claimed that while the EU had its flaws, undoubtedly it would have been in the UK's best interest to negotiate new terms rather than up and leave. This was a rhetoric supported by Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party until 2020.
We believe that Britain will be better off in the European Union, not because we don't think Europe needs a lot of change and a lot of reform.
However, Labour's campaign to remain was widely seen as lacklustre and unenthusiastic. Corbyn, a long-time Eurosceptic, was criticised for failing to mount a strong defence of the EU. Unlike David Cameron and the Conservatives, who ran an aggressive Remain campaign, Labour's messaging was weaker, failing to energise its traditional working-class base. But there was a voice among the party that was louder than the rest. Unfortunately for Labour, it was a voice rooting for the other side. Meet Gisela Stuart, a former member of Labour, now a crossbencher in the House of Lords and a champion of the Brexit campaign. As a Labour MP, she was an outlier in her party, which overwhelmingly supported remaining in the European Union. Her decision to back the Leave campaign provided it with an important cross-party appeal, helping to sway Labour-leaning voters who might otherwise have dismissed Brexit as a purely Conservative or UKIP-driven cause. Stewart's central message revolved around democracy and accountability, She argued that EU membership had stripped the UK of its control over its own laws and policies, making it impossible for elected representatives to truly govern in the public interest. As chair of the Vote Leave campaign, she appeared in debates and interviews to push the message that Brexit was about restoring sovereignty. One of her key statements was, "If we want to make our laws, control our borders, and spend our money as we choose, we have to leave the EU." What made Stewart particularly effective was her ability to speak to working-class Labour voters who had grown disillusioned with the party's pro-EU stance. She argued that EU policies, particularly freedom of movement, had negatively impacted low-income communities by driving down wages and increasing pressure on public services. But this isn't to suggest that Gisela's pro-Brexit stance wasn't met with criticism from within the party itself. Again, while Labour was criticised for its weak pro-EU stance, the party was majorly in support of remaining in the EU. We can't be too sure, but an educated guess would suggest that internal conflicts were what led to Gisela ultimately leaving Labour. She didn't seek re-election in 2017. Moreover, after becoming an influential figure in the lead-up to the Brexit referendum, Gisela took a step back from frontline politics entirely. However, her impact had already been made. She had given the Leave campaign legitimacy among left-leaning voters, broadening its appeal beyond the right-wing populism of UKIP and the conservative Eurosceptics. It's 2016, the referendum is a few weeks away, and you're still undecided on which way to vote. You are, in this case, the audience Nigel Farage was hoping to sway in the lead to the Brexit vote. Unlike other champions of the Leave group, Farage's strategy was to appeal to the voters who were still undecided. He knew that there were loud voices on both ends, Leave and Remain, but ultimately, the tiebreaker would be the voting group that needed that extra push. Farage was determined to give them that push through his strong anti-EU stance, which branched further into an anti-immigration one. As the leader of the UK Independence Party, UKIP, Farage had been advocating for Brexit for years before it became a reality. It's worth mentioning here that Farage was not a member of the official Vote Leave campaign. Farage's ability to connect with the frustrations of the average Briton, particularly those who felt ignored by the political establishment, made him an instrumental force in the Leave campaign's success. The populist message is simply a type of political rhetoric that frames politics as a struggle between the ordinary people and the elite. For example, Farage claimed that leaving the EU was about taking back control from unelected bureaucrats, portraying the EU as an oppressive force harming ordinary Britons. Similarly, Boris Johnson framed Brexit as a chance for Britain to regain its independence from an overreaching European elite. This approach was particularly effective in traditional Labour voting areas, where economic hardship and a sense of cultural displacement fueled resentment toward the EU. Farage's core message revolved around border control and perceived threats of mass immigration. He argued that EU membership prevented Britain from controlling its own borders, allowing an unchecked influx of migrants that put pressure on jobs, housing, and public services. One of his most infamous campaign moments was the unveiling of the Breaking Point poster, which showed a long queue of migrants with the caption, "We must break free of the EU and take back control of our borders." Without Farage's relentless campaigning and his ability to channel public frustration, Brexit might never have gained the momentum it needed to succeed. In the twist of the century, we're now going to talk about how the EU itself might just have been one of the most compelling forces that swayed voters to vote Leave on the day of the referendum. For some context, the EU couldn't make the UK stay a part of the Union once Article 50 was evoked. Brussels could, however, try to work out terms that would compel the nation to stay, and they did try, but why wasn't it enough? To backtrack a little here, anti-EU sentiments weren't quite unique to the United Kingdom. If anything, Euroscepticism had been on the rise for several years, with nations such as Greece, France, and Hungary advocating for a referendum of their own long before the June 2016 vote was held in the UK. They didn't just spring out of nowhere. Indeed, the EU has been criticised for leading to a loss of national sovereignty, uncontrolled immigration, and being an economic burden. Cameron recognised all three factors when he called for the referendum, but he believed that he could find a workaround with Brussels. Many believed that the former Prime Minister had used the referendum as a bargaining chip in negotiations with Brussels, showcasing that the UK could leave, even if Cameron himself believed that the nation would ultimately vote Remain. But it wasn't as strong of a bargaining chip as he thought. Cameron sought changes in three key areas: immigration, sovereignty, and economic policy. He wanted to curb EU migrants' access to UK welfare benefits, secure exemptions from further political integration, and gain reassurances that non-Eurozone countries like Britain wouldn't be disadvantaged in EU economic policies. However, the EU leadership offered only minor concessions, such as a temporary restriction on in-work benefits for migrants, while rejecting deeper reforms. This lack of flexibility reinforced the perception that the EU was unwilling to accommodate the UK's concerns. Many voters saw Cameron's failed recognition as proof that Britain had little control over its own affairs within the EU. The Leave campaign capitalised on this, arguing that the only way to truly regain sovereignty was to exit the bloc entirely. Had the EU capitalised on that moment and given in to what the UK had asked for, maybe it would have been enough for the nation to stay, right? Arguably, yes, but that would have opened up a can of worms with every member nation using the threat of Article 50 to renegotiate terms with the EU, effectively dismantling the idea that the Union was equal for all members. Still, we can't understate the fact that one of the biggest reasons why Britons voted to leave was because they saw firsthand that the EU wasn't willing to budge. So, between Boris Johnson, Gisela Stuart, Nigel Farage, and the EU itself, who do you think had the biggest role to play in the Brexit mess?